Welcome back, Physics 1 students and other randos from the internet seeking Excel help. So we're on part 2 now, our graphing sheet. So the purpose of this part is to teach you how to graph in Excel because we will be doing a lot of graphs as part of our physics labs. So I noticed that students do struggle with creating graphs, and I think that's probably because y'all were taught the same way that I was taught, how to graph in Excel, and that's where you highlight all of your data. So if I was trying to do my D versus T graph, I would highlight these two cells, I would click insert, I would add my graph, right? And the reason that I'm going to discourage this practice is just because you're less involved with assigning your axes. The way that I'm going to show you how to do this, you are directly assigning which axis gets which data, okay? Which I think is a great sanity check too. When you're more involved in the process, you know that your graph is right. If you just click on this, it's like, well, did my T end up on my x-axis or on my y-axis? You got to take a minute and look at this, and you know, you got to say, okay, I've got like negative 7.9, 8.8. Okay, so that means that T must be on my x-axis and D is on my y-axis, right? But if you're going in and manually assigning which data goes on which axis, then you know automatically, right? So I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to get rid of this graph. That also saves you time too, because if we want to graph T versus D, which we are going to be doing, you would have to go ahead and you would have to copy your data in the reverse order, right, in order to get the other graph, and then highlight this and then add your graph, right? This saves you the time where you don't have to do that. You don't have to copy and paste your data in your correct order to get the graph that you need, right? Because you can just manually select exactly where you want which data. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that. So let's start off. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to click in a cell way out in the middle of nowhere, so there's no chance that it's going to try and grab your data. All right, then you're going to click insert, scatter. We're always going to use the very first scatter plot, so you click scatter. If you didn't click out far enough in the middle of nowhere, this will not be a blank chart, but if you did, congratulations, we can move on to the next step. So the next step is we're going to click select data. All right, now we want to add a series to our graph, so we're going to click add. For our series name, I'm going to do the D versus T graph first, so D versus T. The X values, so the way that I determine what the X values are is the name of my graph is always Y versus X, okay? If I'm doing the convention where I have verses between my two variables, it is Y versus X, okay? The other way that you could name a graph is to describe the slope. So I could call this graph speed, but I tend to just stick to the Y versus X because that will never fail you. There's no chance that you could incorrectly determine what the slope is. So, like I said, I tend to stick to just Y versus X. So, that being said, we know that our X values are our T values, right? So we're going to highlight our T values. There we go. Then for our Y values, well, it's Y versus X, so Y is our D values. So we're going to highlight our D values. There we go. We can click OK. Now, if we wanted to add a second series, like we will do in the friction lab, we would click to add another series, but in this case, we just want the one graph, right? So we don't need to click add, we can click OK. And now we want to add a layout. So you're going to click quick layout, and the very first one is perfect. So click that first one. All right. Now you don't necessarily have to spell out all of your terms. I tend to do this, but I won't take off points if you're abbreviating things and your captions make it clear what's going on in your figure, right? But like I said, I like to type them out, so I'm going to type out everything. So distance versus time. For the axes titles, that would be distance on the y-axis, and the units are meters. Okay, so you could just do D and meters, right? And then on the x-axis, we have time in seconds. You could do T and seconds as the unit. And then one thing that I also like to do when I only have one series on my graph, so I can't possibly get confused about, you know, what data is what, I just delete the legend, okay? So I delete the legend. That allows us to make our graph bigger and fill up the space a lot more. But like I said, I only do that when I have the one series and I can't possibly confuse it, right? All right, so I'm going to put this off to the side. We will be adding the trend line in a little bit. But now I'm going to move on to my time versus distance graph. So again, I click out in the middle of nowhere. I click insert. I choose the first scatter plot. I have a blank chart. This is good. I move on to select data. I click add. My series name is going to be T versus D this time. Remember, Y versus X, so that means T is now my Y value and D is my X value. All right, so I'm going to highlight my D values for X, and I'm going to highlight my T values for Y, and then I'm going to click OK and click OK, and there we go. Now I want to add in my quick layout, right? Here we go. So I'm going to label everything, so time versus distance, and down here we have distance this time, and the units are meters. I keep spelling this atrociously. There we go, distance, and then time is on the y-axis. There we go. And as I mentioned before, we've only got the one series, so I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this legend. All right. So the last thing that we need to do here is we need to right-click any one of our points on the graph. All right. So I right-click. That gives me this drop-down menu. I'm going to choose Select Trend Line or Add Trend Line. Then I'm going to display the equation on chart. All right. Now, I didn't change my trend line option. Why? Because this is clearly a line, right? But there will be some times where you're graphing things, and like in Lab 2, where you don't have a linear relationship. So you do need to be conscious of what trend line option you have. In Lab 2, you're going to have a parabola, so that's going to be polynomial order 2. Okay, so make sure that you're not fitting it with a line, because a line will not fit a curve, right? Basically, all you want to do is make sure that you're choosing your best fit, okay? In this case, it's a line. That's the default in Excel, so I don't need to mess with it. All right, so we're good. Close that out. I'm just going to more centrally locate my trend line. Then I'm going to do the same thing for time versus distance. I right-click one of my points. I click Add Trend Line. Then I display equation on chart, and that's it. All right, now I've got my two graphs. So one little thing for just a bonus round here that isn't really part of the lab, right? But just to show you how to add a second series if you wanted to. So over here, I'm just going to call this, we'll call it distance 2. So I'll call it D2, and this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? Those are my data points. So now let's just say I wanted to create a graph that it had D and D2 on the y-axis and then just time on the x-axis, okay? There are two different objects, they're going different distances, but there's the same timer, okay? So I click out in the middle of nowhere, I do insert, I do scatter, right? I've got my blank chart, I click select data, I click add. For my series name, I'm going to be doing D versus T. My X values, those are going to be T. Okay, so I highlight those. My Y values, I'm going to do D first. Okay, so that's good. I click OK. Now I want to add a second series. Okay, so I click Add. This is going to be D2 versus T. And then my X values, those are going to be T. My Y values are going to be D2. Okay, so I click OK, and I click OK, and now you can see we have both of those on this graph, right? Then I could add in my quick layout, and this is one of the times where I would want to leave the legend alone so I know which graph is which. and I would call this probably D versus T, and I would know that this was my distance in meters and my time in seconds. And then that would be it, right? So this is just an example. If you had two series like we will have in Lab 7, this is how you would add two series to the graph, okay? So, but we're not doing this, so I'm going to get rid of that. And this concludes our part 2, the graphing section. So I will see you in part 3 for our analysis section.